Hello and welcome to this month's Newbies event. We're going to be talking all about homeschool report cards. So whether that's a literal report card that you create for your student or just more information about record keeping, what types of materials to keep, what things you don't actually need, and more. I've got Jen, one of your Sonlight mentors here today, and we're going to talk all about this topic. Jen, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to anybody who maybe is unfamiliar with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jen. I am one of the mentors on the Sonlight app, and I was a homeschooling mom of four for 23 years. I used Sonlight all the way through, and I lived in several different states, so I have had to keep records several different ways.
Yes, I'm so glad you're here because, yeah, I've homeschooled in only two states, but we will talk a little bit about that. Sometimes what you need is different depending on where you live. And then also the students you have, how old they are, what your goals are, all of that. If you've watched any of our other sessions, you'll know that Jen is a little more laid back than I am. So I wanted to get her perspective as well. So you can kind of see both ends of the spectrum as far as keeping everything, keeping nothing. So that way you'll have a better idea depending on your situation and what might work best for you. For those of you unfamiliar with me, I am Sunny. I'm Sonlight's community manager, and I'm also a Sonlight mom of two kids actively homeschooling with Sonlight. They are currently in ninth and fourth grades. And so right now I keep much more detailed records for my older student being in high school and way less for my younger student, but we'll dive right into all of that as well. So let's get started, Jen. First, let's talk about what records you need to keep. For a newbie, they may not even know what they need to keep or what they should be tracking in their first year homeschooling. What advice would you give there?
Well, that's kind of two questions in one. One part of that question is, what academic work do I need to keep um, to understand how my child is doing, or measure progress, or prove to somebody that we've homeschooled? The other part of that question is, what records do I need to keep to be legally homeschooling in my state? So whatever paperwork your state requires, you have to maintain because that's the law. In terms of academic work, I kept a lot of stuff throughout the year. So, like, obviously the pages in the math book got filled. I kept all of our writing samples. But then at the end of the year, when we looked back, there was a lot of, if you look at something from the beginning of the year, from the middle, from the end, you really can easily see the progress that they've made. And so I didn't keep everything once the year was over, but when I lived in a high reporting state, I did keep everything until I got that letter that said, thank you for fulfilling your requirements. You're checked off for the year. At that point, I ditched all the paperwork.
Yeah, so like Jen said, you're going to want to double check what do you need in your state. I mean, some states it's just attendance. You need to report what days you did school. Others you need to report hours. Some states do portfolios where you actually need samples of the work. I've been fortunate, both states that I lived in, I did not have to submit actual samples of student work. It was more about attendance and having a registered homeschool situation with the state. But yeah, like Jen said, there are some high reporting states and some states where you tell somebody one time and then you're pretty much done. So you will want to look at that and make sure that whatever you need to legally homeschool, you have. The easiest way I did it, though, was just keep everything in a manila envelope. That way I've got it and I can go back and reference things. And then I just mark the dates on a calendar now that I am in a state where that is important. But there are very simple ways to do this. It doesn't have to be a whole drawn out process. What are some good ideas and ways to record the information you may need to show to an evaluator, or that you may need to report if you've got certain dates or hours and that type of stuff that you have to submit to the state?
So when I lived in a state where I was required to record attendance, um, I printed out a like by the year on one page calendar, and I marked every day that we did enough school to count as a day, which was my like my judgment call. But if we did enough that I counted it as a school day, I marked that. And then at the end of the year, I had a calendar that showed which days we did school. The first year that I lived in that state, I was concerned that we wouldn't get in all like 180 days that we were required. And it took about, I don't know, 200 days to get that many. But then I had like 160 days left and I had done plenty. So after about the third year of worrying about it and then recording all of those days, I really was like, you know what? We do plenty of school. It'll be okay. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's something to remember. It's equivalent hours, right? So if your state requires, say, 4 hours, this is just a random number. I don't know what your state requires. You'll want to look at that specific to you. But if it requires 4 hours, that does not mean 4 hours of your student sitting at the table, doing math, doing history, doing science, all of that, because to Jen's point, you are going to be teaching them year round. Don't forget, if you take a field trip that's educational, if you do co-op activities, if you're doing service projects, anything that would count as a normal school day, you can count that stuff as well. So if you have questions, about, oh, does this count as school? Drop that in the Sonlight Connections app and we will tell you how it probably does. Because to Jen's point, that was something that early on I was like, oh, that means sitting there looking at their schoolwork. I did not think about the fact that you do teach your kids. I say every day, really, we're doing something educational, but definitely during the school year when you're doing a lot of that stuff, you are going to be teaching them throughout the day, even if it doesn't feel like it. Or if your kids are very young and their official schoolwork is done quickly, you're still going to be getting a lot of that work in. And so, yeah, what I do is I just use the instructor's guide as my attendance record and I write the date at the top. What date did we do school? In my case, in Colorado, we have an umbrella school that we submit records to. And so they have a spreadsheet that they have us just fill out what dates we did school. So I just go back to my IG at the end of the year, plug it into their spreadsheet and submit it. So look at your state organization, look to see if you have a cover school, whatever that might be, and figure out what's going to work for submitting it. But again, it's, I think, a lot simpler than people realize at first when they just see a list of things they have to do. Now, what about grades or report cards for the student? Is that something you have to do? If so, how do you do it? And if you don't give them grades, how do you actually assess their progress to make sure they're learning and ready to move on to the next year?
I never lived in a state where I was required to do grades for anybody below high school. So I never did grades for anybody below high school. We did have several years where we had an evaluator. And so I had to show work, let the, like have like an interview between the three of us with an evaluator to establish what level they were working at in different things and show that they had made progress through the year. We did that by keeping work. Like we kept every page of the math book that we did. We looked at examples from the beginning, from the middle, from the end, and we were always finding that the kids were doing math they could not have done at the beginning of the school year, which is my definition of progress. I kind of had it easy. All of my kids, I mean, except for like, I'm thinking of 2 different spots in math where we hit like big road bumps, but they progressed. Their writing got better because they wrote every day. Their math skills got better because we did math every day, those kinds of things. So we kept work. We, looked back from different points in the year. The progress is super easy to see.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say something to bear in mind too is you are spending time with that student daily, one-on-one. So unlike a classroom where grades are helpful for a teacher who's trying to keep track of 20 or more students at once, you are working one-on-one with that child every day. So it is a little easier to see that. What else were you going to add there before I go on?
I was going to say, also remember that grades, to your point, grades are a tangible measure of a standard for teachers to translate to students and to parents how they are doing. As the teacher and parent of only a few students, you know how they're doing. So if I said to you, Sunny, how is your daughter's writing this year? Is she making progress? Is she meeting her goals? Is like, tell me how it's going. You don't need to look in a grade book to tell me in detail what is going well, what things you're concerned about, what things, you still need to work on, what goals she's met for. Like, all that because you only have 2 students and you're with them in the trenches every single day. So like, I don't know, unless you're reporting to your state, because that's how they do it. Like, I don't know that grades across those younger years are terribly important because you know how they're doing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would actually argue, especially with a younger student, sometimes a grade can make things harder for them than they really need to be. I mean, for anyone who went to school and remembers grades, I feel like it was either like, oh, yay, I'm proud of myself because I did well, or oh, no, I'm not very smart because I'm not making the grade I want. Like, I feel like there's a lot of emotion tied into grades, that one of the beauties of homeschooling is that you can kind of skip over that and teach the child that learning is fun and you're learning for learning's sake, as opposed to, oh, I need to memorize all of this so I can get an A, but then I'm going to forget it all once I'm done. Did that child really learn? That's kind of, it's one of those arbitrary standards that, again, a teacher is using because they're managing an entire classroom. But with a young student, I think, like what Jen said, is the writing improving? Are they doing things in math that they couldn't do at the beginning of the year? A child learning to read, it's very easy to see the progress happening or not happening there throughout the year. And so, yeah, I think putting a measure on a young student can actually be more to their detriment than just teaching them and going along at the pace that works for them. Because especially those early years, kids are going to learn all of those early learning skills at a different rate. And so, especially if you've got several kids close in age, that might be kind of intimidating or stressful for them if you're comparing them to each other, or anything like that. So, yeah, I actually avoid all grades early on in the early years. We'll go through math and I circle, oh, you missed these problems. Let's go back and correct them. Or with reading and handwriting, those types of things, any type of writing, oh, we misspelled this word. Let's circle it and figure out the right way to do it. So you're still correcting things, but it's not like, oh, you failed this. Look at all the things you missed. Or, oh, you didn't have any mistakes here. I might bring that up to them, but I'm not going to say, oh, you have an A in math or you have a B in history or any of this, especially with a literature-based program like Sonlight, because you're discussing the books. You really don't need grades for that, because those conversations are going to tell you, is my student listening? Are they understanding what they're hearing? How is this sinking in? And then in high school, that is where I started doing grades, because now I'm creating a transcript for my daughter that's in high school. And so that's a little different, where you have to worry about that. But I think you said something earlier, Jen. The idea of grading felt very intimidating early on to me, but you said you decide what the standard is. Can you describe that a little bit more? So for those who have older students, or maybe they do have to report grades to their state organization, how do they determine those grades and know how to do that with a student if they are the ones figuring out what that standard is?
You mean in high school?
Yeah.
Okay, so I got the best piece of advice ever before my oldest started high school from a homeschool mama who was farther down the road than I was. And she said, decide before you start working what gets an A. And so if you're doing high school literature, if you're doing, I don't know, whatever year you're doing, to get an A in literature, you need to read this many books. You need to write this many papers. That, one of them has to be at least this long. You have to, do whatever, this much vocabulary. You have to do, maybe you throw in their Wordly Wise book. Maybe you throw in, a workbook about grammar or analogies or whatever you decide. Please do not do all of those things in one year. And you say, Like, I just wrote down, this is the list of things you're going to do. We called it course contract. She and I agreed beforehand, this is what gets you an A. Do these things, get an A. Like with her writing, we used rubrics. And so I said, if every paper that you turn in, long, short, in between, whatever, is worth at least, it was 30 points on our rubric. If you get, like, it was like 30 out of 36, if you correct it all so that it's 5s and 6s only, you're done. That's an A. Do all of these things on this list, read all these books, write this many papers, you're done. And that worked really well because, number one, it kept the standard up. By February, March, when I was like, Lord help me, just make dinner and finish this year, we didn't slip because we had the standards written down. It helped when there was a disagreement between my teenager and me. That probably never happens to you, but every once in a while in my house, a teenager disagrees with their mom. And we could just go back to the paper and be like, nope, we agreed this many, not 8, all 9. But that took me out of that bad guy spot because the contract says. And then at the end of the year, when it was like, oh my gosh, is this an A? Is this a B? It's like, she read everything on the contract. She wrote and rewrote papers to this standard that we decided beforehand, did all the other things. That's an A.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love, what you said about it sets the standard early so they know what to expect. I think sometimes when I see people saying, oh, my child's not doing what they need to do, it's often because you did not make that expectation clear to the student ahead of time. So, just remember they can't read your mind. They don't know what you're expecting them to do for something like that. I think it's great to have it written down. Here's what you need to do to earn that A. Something else that I do with both of my kids, but especially my teen who is being graded, is I can tell if she's put forth every bit of effort that she can, or if she's kind of slacking off. And if you've taught your student at all for any length of time, you very quickly realize, like, oh, this is not their best work, or this is them trying. And so that is part of my standard too. I don't want to see you being lazy just because you think you can get away with it. I do expect your best work, whatever that is, in whatever subject. And I know where her strengths and weaknesses are. So, of course, my daughter is very much, she loves to read. Her writing is very strong. She's more that Englishy history student, right? Versus the math and science student. And so I'm not going to expect the same standard necessarily, but I do want to see that she's doing her best work and she's learning the concepts in the maths and sciences as well. So yeah, I think it's important to look at your student and figure out what matters to you. Make sure that that's very clear to them at the beginning. And then something else I like to do with both of my kids is let them get some amount of say in it, especially as they get older. But even when my kids are very small, I've talked about this in other sessions, that I let them choose what order we read the books in or what subject we do first. I think it's so important. If you just sit there like a taskmaster and do things the way you want to, you'll kind of lose the joy or the passion for your student, or it will cause more of those fights between mom and student than if you kind of let them get a say in what they want to do. So for a high schooler, choosing the classes they want to take, don't force your non-sciencey kid to take all the science classes, for example, or your non-mathy kid to take calculus in high school. That may not be the path they want to go. But even young students, look at the way they learn and let them have some say in it.
I agree. I think that having buy-in from the kids increases the joy so much because it lets them feel like they have a little control. It makes them feel like they have a little bit of say. And especially as they get older, I mean, my oldest was famous for any writing assignment I gave her, because very often the writing assignment will be about a book or about whatever we're doing in history, right? Okay, that's the beauty of Sonlight. And she would come back at me with, I don't want to write about that. Can I write about what? And she would, it seemed extremely random to me. She would pick some other thing. And I learned to say, yeah, Like, it has to fulfill the requirements. If this is about like a biographical thing, then like you need to pick somebody and write a biographical thing. Do I care who it's about? No. Would it be really easy for you to write about the person we've been reading about? Yes. You would rather write about John Adams? Sold. I am not dying on the whose biography hill. I mean, that's just because buy-in helps. And this is like, I did not expect it, but then there it was it saved me from overworking a good student. Because if I said, you have to finish this Wordly Wise book and this vocabulary and this reading list, and they were in March, like, okay, I'm done. This was, like, it's all done. I struggled against the urge to say, okay, then let's do more. Okay, then more. And I would have burned her out.
Mm-hmm.
And like striving for excellence, which is good. But when I had to decide beforehand what was enough, then that was enough. And if you got it done quickly, great. And if it took you a year and a half, whatever, because we had the standard set first. So, it's not only like making sure you do enough, but making sure, I mean, for me, that I wasn't burning out a quick reading, likes to write, good student. I would have put way too much in if that contract didn't hold me back. So
that's such a great point too, because that is going to be more applicable to college or career down the line, right? If you have a project to do, your employer or your professor doesn't care when you did it as long as it's done by the due date. And so, yeah, penalizing a good student by giving them more work is not really fair to them either. So, yeah, I love that of saying, here's what the standard is. Once you've met it, if you want to get done earlier, that's on you, and then you get a longer break. Or if you have a student, because I know the Sonlight High School programs, they are rigorous. I have a strong reader, and I mean, it's still a lot with a strong reader. So if you're looking at them and you don't have a strong reader and you're like, what do I do there? Feel free to cut things out, to modify it to meet the needs of your student. There is nothing that says you have to do any Sonlight program exactly as it's written. And I think most of us who have used Sonlight for any period of time would tell you that we all modify in one way, shape, or form, depending on the student. So don't feel like they have to do everything the way it's written in your instructor's guide either. You as the parent get to determine what that standard is.
Or substitute. That was
yeah.
one of my favorites, because I didn't necessarily want to cut something all the way out, but the way it was written was just not going to work for us. The example I'm thinking of is Great Expectations. And I was an English major. I love to read. I love the classics. Dickens, not so much. So I made my students a deal. They could read Great Expectations, do the written questions as written, do all the mapping and all the vocabulary, and report back to me. And I mean, Great Expectations is like, that is a chunky book. Or they could read aloud with me A Christmas Carol, and the only extra thing they had to do was watch Muppet Christmas Carol with me. And that was the project. So I felt free to substitute one Dickens for another Dickens. And they're all, I mean, 3 out of the 4 are so far are successful adults. The other one is still in high school, but so I have no substituting shame right there.
Well, and I love that that was your example, because I thought I didn't like Dickens from my own Great Expectations experience in high school. And more than 20 years later, I finally read A Christmas Carol with my kids and discovered, oh no, it's not Dickens. It's just that book that I didn't like. So I love that that was your example. And I think, yeah, as adults, how often have we revisited a book that we didn't like back in school, or an author that we thought we didn't like, and we discover, oh, there actually are some good things here. So I love that when you're homeschooling, you can kind of help your student get to that place a lot faster than where it's one required reading. And even in school, I remember I had a teacher who said, here's what we're all reading, but if you don't want to read this book, here's a list of other approved books. So I actually had a teacher in high school who allowed us to kind of choose our own. So yeah, I think that's a great thing to do is give your kids some buy-in, make it fun for them, and let them kind of create the path they want, with you there to guide them with, okay, you still have to do these certain things to graduate because you need those skills, but the rest of it, kind of letting them choose, I think is so helpful. But what do you do after your year's done, everything's submitted? I'm talking now more about younger students as well, not just high school. You've already turned things into your umbrella school or your state organization. What do you keep or discard? And then what things should you consider if this is your oldest child, or if this is your youngest child and you're not going to have any more coming behind them? What do you think?
Well, once I get that letter, I live in a state where you get a letter after you turn in your required end of the year things that says, thank you, you are in compliance for the 2000 whatever school year. For next year, if you are continuing to homeschool, please submit XYZ. Okay. Once I have that letter, which I keep, I toss all the used workbooks. I keep like my favorite writing samples or whatever, but I lose it all. I do not keep any of that old work. I will keep like art projects or, like I said, writing samples, but like nothing. I keep nothing. It all goes. The curriculum that we are now done with, whatever that year was, I had 4 kids who were just far enough apart that I could combine nobody. So I've always been very jealous of people who could just combine and do it all together. I had to box it all up and save it for the next kid, because if I did not put it in a box and hide it, my children would abscond with their favorite books, and then it would not be complete when I needed it in 3 years. So I boxed it all up. And then at the very end, after the last kid, when I thought we were done with some things and would get rid of some books, the children quickly corrected me. We have gotten rid of almost nothing because every book was somebody's favorite.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is something important to remember, even if you don't have kids coming where you're going to need instructor's guides and worksheets again. Oftentimes those books are favorites. And so, yeah, my husband keeps asking, well, do we need the preschool books anymore? And I'm like, we might, and we never know who's going to come over with a preschooler. Like, so I still have all the books. Now, I have also kept everything kind of by accident, in that when my older child was going through, I kept the instructor's guides, planning to use those again with my younger child. If you've got a big age gap and that's something you want to do, go ahead and purchase those worksheets for the remaining children up front, because Sonlight may or may not have them by the time you're ready to use them again. Or keep a clean copy and make copies even for your oldest student to use of the worksheets. That was something I didn't even think about. My daughter wrote on everything. And then by the time my son was ready for those same levels, I realized, oh, my kids are 5 years apart. So they were well past the age that I could even get the same worksheets again. And so that was when I started taking advantage of my repurchase discount on the instructor's guide. So if you're unfamiliar with that and you've purchased your instructor's guide from Sonlight and you're saying, oh no, I let my kids write on the worksheet and then I have another one coming in a few years, what do? You can actually repurchase those instructor's guides for 50% off. So I started doing that, and that will come with all clean worksheets. It will come with any updates, which if you've got a 5-year age gap, there's probably at least a few. But what I discovered the first year or two of doing that was that the new updates met IGs in color and science sheets in color and new books and all these things that I didn't have the first time around. And so after a couple of years of that, I realized you know what, I'm not going to reuse any of the instructor's guides in their entirety, maybe in the high school levels, but definitely not in the lower levels again. So I just repurchase every year, and I'm a sucker for all the new books. So I get all the updated books. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the way I have done it. But bear in mind, if you are planning for a younger child, you absolutely can use the exact same program again. Many people do that successfully for years and years and years. I just, as I saw new things coming out, I was like, oh, I want this, and I want the new books and all of that. And every program I've used two different ways, like Level D, for example. I used one program with my older child, and it was almost totally new by the time my second child used it, and I loved it even more the second time. So you decide what type of person you are. Are you going to want to read the same exact things over again? Are you going to want to do it differently? Now Sonlight has way more hands-on options, which has been great with my younger student as well. So kind of look at that and decide what you're going to do. But of course, we do still have the majority of our books the second time around. So IKEA bookshelves will hold a lot. We have on two of them preschool through 200. So I'm going to see if I can squeeze another level on those before I get a new bookshelf. But if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have the space, like Jen said, she packed them all away. I just like them all out because that is the one thing I like to look at my books. So,
Mhm.
and the kids do like to come back and reread them. So kind of decide what's going to work for your child. But again, like Jen said, you don't have to keep every piece of paper. Although, because of the age gap in my kids, it is kind of fun to go back and see when my son does a writing assignment. Oh, I wonder what my daughter said about that, because it's a far enough gap. I don't remember exactly
Yep.
what her assignment looked like. So I do like to go back and look at that. But again, it's kind of your personality. What do you like? I know my mom, much like you, Jen, what she hates clutter, hates anything extra, very much a
Oh,
minimalist. She would have thrown
oh,
it all away.
yep. And I'm not a repurchaser. I was the mom who was like, I'm going to buy enough copies of these science worksheets with the first round because I'm not planning on upgrading later. The exception that I made was for F when they included the Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere book. That was such a wild upgrade from the spine that was used before it, that I mean, I got that like it was still smoking hot, brand new off the presses. And when my third child got to do F with that book, the older kids were like, "Are you kidding me? Are you even kidding me? This book is so great, it's almost like cheating." So, the nice thing for her was that she had a lot of older sibling help because they wanted an excuse to sit down with that book and help her. So, that was my major like repurchase upgrade was Journey to the Eastern Hemisphere, which, is a great book and so useful for that notebooking. So, yeah, other than that, I just reused the old worksheets and stuff.
Well, and I love what you said about that older siblings will come back, regardless of if you're upgrading or not. I know there are definitely times I get out a book and my daughter's like, ooh, I really liked that one. And so she'll come back to listen to it again, even though it's been years since she did it the first time. So that is something, yeah. If you're like, oh, I'm not going to need these books next year, and you're just starting out, maybe hold on to them a few years to see, especially if you have young students that aren't reading themselves yet. All of those early read alouds that you read to them in pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, those are the books they're going to come back and read once they can read on their own. So I know the Usborne Greek Myths book that's in B, that book
Yep.
was falling apart because
Yep.
once my daughter could read, she was reading it. I think I did have to buy a new one for my son because it was just like pages by the
In
time he was
tatters.
ready
Yep.
to be.
Yep.
so so that's something to keep in mind too. Your kids will come back and read some, but especially if only your oldest child has gone through, you will want to hold on to stuff for younger
Mhm.
children. But it may or may not include all of the instructor's guide worksheets if you purchased another set ahead of time or made copies. So if you have any questions about the copyright too, definitely let us know, because I know sometimes people are curious about that. What can you copy? What can you not for your students? And they do have to be for your own family. So
Mhm.
if you have any questions, let us know about that. Are there any other considerations, Jen? I know sometimes parents are worried about their student might be going back to school at some point,
Mhm.
and so they're wondering what type of records they need to keep to put their student back in school. Or we lightly touched on high school, but obviously if you're applying to college and homeschooling all the way through, or your students doing a combination of school, homeschool before college, those types of things, what are some other things that they might want to consider for those more unique situations than just homeschooling all the way through?
So I've put kids back in school. 3 of my students have gone to public high school for at least a year or two. Um, we needed no past work. They were not interested. Either they took my word for it, has he done Spanish 1? Has he done Algebra 1? Or they said, all transferring students take a math test, we will place him. Um, Either way, they required no paperwork or proof of competency from us. So I have not found that keeping anything or taking any kind of portfolio with me was needed at all. Um, for college, so we've been through the college application process twice. Your mileage may vary. Always go to the college website. They always have an admissions officer who is experienced working with homeschoolers. At this point, colleges are used to homeschoolers. It's not like, I mean, there are millions of homeschoolers. And so they have policies for it. One of the schools that we applied to, there was one extra sheet of paper that had to be filled out um, for homeschoolers specifically. Everybody else just wanted a transcript with the name of the course, the grade, and the credits given. And I mean, you calculate credits by hours. If you do 45 minutes a day for 180 days, that is standard. Um, that's that's the advice that we have been given. They do not want course description, in my experience. Again, contact the college you're applying to, because they all can be different. They did not want 1,000 details. They did not want a gigantic portfolio of work. They wanted it to look like everybody else that was applying, and that's what they get from public school students. So we didn't find that there was a ton of extra stuff to do to apply to college. My advice for homeschooling high schoolers with an interest in going to college is, at the end of every single year, fill out their transcript for that year. At the end of 9th grade, open a Google Doc, write, Algebra 1, English 9, Spanish 2, biology, whatever. Record the grades, record the credit hours, because by the end of junior year, you will not remember. You think you will remember, and I am here to tell you ahead of time, you will not remember. Keep track as you go. The only other considerations that, like, you might need more records or details or something would be the military, because I know that has changed. And I from what I have heard from people, it's different depending on how you want to get in and what branch and what level and all that stuff. And if you have a NCAA athlete and you are looking to apply for scholarships or do whatever, NCAA has extremely strict requirements. So make sure on the front end that you're fulfilling all of their needs so that you're eligible for whatever it is you want.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Researching kind of along the lines of what your student plans to do is super helpful, because one college may require something, a scholarship is going to require more probably.
Mhm.
Something else that I did before my daughter started high school is I looked to see what the state requires of public school students in high school. They actually do not have the same standard for homeschool students. I can choose what I want to do. But like Jen said, with college applications, they're going to be looking for whatever looks normal to them,
Mhm.
right? So most of the kids that are going to be applying that they're looking at are coming from school. So what does a normal high school transcript look like? Am I making sure that mine looks similar enough that they're not going to be like, what is this? Like, this is
Mhm.
weird. Like Jen said, we're living in a time now where colleges get lots of applicants from homeschoolers. That's something that they're actually looking for because they know homeschoolers are good students typically. So yeah, figuring out, okay, what plan or path do I think my child will do? And in the case of my daughter, what we did was we said, okay, you may or may not want to apply to college, but if you do, let's get everything set up now. So,
Mhm.
because in seventh, eighth grade, she didn't know. And even now as a freshman, she doesn't know entirely what she wants to do. But I did not want us her senior year to have to come back and say, oh my goodness, we didn't do any of the credits you're going to need to get into this college, or any of that. So
Yep.
look at it and figure it out. And like Jen said, make that list as you go. That's what we've done this year. She's in ninth grade, so we still have 3 years ahead. But we've made the list of here's all the classes, here's the credits, and then I'll plug in her grades at the end of the year. But I've also been kind of tracking them as we go. I just put 36 weeks in an Excel spreadsheet so that I
Yep.
can check off with each week of my instructor's guide. What has she done? What grades has she made? Again, I'm pretty type A and very detailed. And so for me, that makes sense in my brain. But like Jen said, you can have a contract that your student just needs to meet these things. You can wait till the end of the year to figure out, actual grades and GPA and all of that.
Mhm.
I just like to know at a glance, so that way, because my daughter, if I do feel she's being a little lazier, I can say, okay, well, here's your grade right now. What are you going to do? Are you going to skip that assignment? Are you not? Are you going to put some effort forth? Or, oh, look, we're kind of on the border between an A and a B, or whatever it might be. And for her, that is very helpful. She likes to see it in front of her. But again, you do not need that level of detail, but I would definitely look at what your child is planning to do in the future. And I love what you said about students transferring to school. I was curious about that myself. I actually, in the middle of high school, transferred from a private school to a public school. And it was similar to what you said. There were things where they looked at what I had taken at the school, but they still wanted to test me to make sure that school standards were the same as theirs. And so they were like, well, we don't know anything about what they taught, which I assume would be the same if you're coming out of homeschool. They don't really know what you taught. And so I had to take tests to verify that,
Mhm.
yes, I was competent enough in this to now take this. So, yeah, I think that's something. And Jen, you may know this. I've seen this, but not having experience with it myself, I've seen a lot of people say, like, your child either has to start high school in school, or once they start homeschooling, they have to go all the way through, because there's not a lot of like back and forth once the student starts high school. What is your experience with that? And what would you tell somebody who's like, oh, I have to make a decision before ninth grade because then it's all or nothing?
Well, so interesting. My oldest had a plan. We lived in a state where you could go part-time. So we made that plan. We registered her. We ended up moving over the summer. And so I was like, we now live in a state where you have to go full-time to high school or homeschool full-time. She chose to stay home. So she homeschooled through all of high school. She did some community college classes her senior year, but she stayed home. So, and we never tried to like put her in school junior year or whatever. My second one didn't want to go to public school freshman year, but decided he did want to go sophomore year. So he did sophomore and junior year there. Transitioning was not a big deal. I was worried. I and then it was not a big deal. They, well, what science did he take? What what math did he take, what Spanish did he take, and they just popped him into the next classes, and it was fine. But when he had graduated and little sister was considering public school for high school, his advice to her was, if you're going to go in as a freshman. And I think that advice was more social, athletic than academic. But she went in freshman year on his advice that if you think you're ever going to want to go, just go. And then March of that year, the world shut down for a pandemic. And she ended up homeschooling the next year, went back junior year, and then did dual enrollment. So she wasn't even in her high school building senior year, and it was fine. And she's in college and she's succeeding and doing well and loving life. And so that is the opposite of any advice I would ever give anybody, but it was fine. My last one is now in public high school, and we're thinking maybe we can just keep this one in school. I have no idea. Fourth time's the charm. It certainly is easier to just go in at the beginning and just have a plan and then do whatever the plan is. But that's not always life.
Mm-hmm.
And we have had no trouble transitioning in, transitioning out, transitioning back in even. Who even does that? But here we were. And so it's really been fine. And the more homeschoolers are out there, the more public schools like have experience working with us. And so the less of a big deal it is. I mean, I think about people who homeschooled like in the 80s and the 90s, and like it was thought of as weird. Public schools could be very like suspicious of the academic rigor. Now it's, there's kids all over the place winning this and that and participating in all these things. And when you find out they homeschool, you're like, oh yeah, you too.
Exactly. I love that, that you said that. And then two, if you think about it, if you were to move in the middle of high school, how many families do that anyway, whether they're going to school or not? Students are able to transfer into schools all the time or out of schools. So I think sometimes as homeschoolers, we put, maybe because we are still in that 80s or 90s mindset of, oh, everyone thinks I'm weird. What am I doing? Am I doing it right? But if we can reassure you at all, I mean, I remember being in college with other homeschoolers. I was homeschooled in 7th grade. It did not negatively impact me. And if anything, is the reason that I homeschool my own kids, because I had done all the different school options when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. And so, it does work out. And so I think, as long as you do your research, which if you're already using Sonlight, you probably kind of like to research at least a little bit, you're willing to read and find that information. It doesn't have to be as intimidating as you might think initially. And as always, if you have questions, we are in the Sonlight Connections app and we're ready to help you answer those questions from our own experience. I love what you said, Jen, that, your mileage may vary, but this is what worked for us. And every person who has graduated students, they will tell you the same thing, right? Here's what happened with my kids. Here's what might happen with yours. Things like that. You brought up athletes, military. I've heard different standards if you're applying to like cosmetology school, things like that. So just look and see, what does your student want to do? But we are available. I'm also going to make sure that we drop the link to our high school transcripts ebook in here as well. So those of you watching that maybe have a high schooler and you are planning to homeschool, but you feel at a total loss for that, we'll have those resources. Is there anything else you would add for anyone, whether they've got littles or bigs or both, and they're trying to figure out what records they need or what materials they need to keep?
My advice is do your research. Every state is different. Like you have an umbrella school, every umbrella school could be different. Every college is different. Even like what you said about, we looked up our state standards for high school graduation. Yours are different than mine. We live in a different state. And so if you do your own research and figure out what you need before it's time to report it, reporting is really very, very easy. It's not intimidating. But if you go in armed with knowing what the rules are and knowing what you're going to have to come up with later, it's much less stressful for me. So
Exactly. Yeah. And if you feel like you're behind or you're not sure, again, post those questions. There will be someone that's very familiar. We also on Sonlight's website have pages for the different states and what their requirements are. So if you're still in the early stages where maybe you didn't have to officially do school this year, because some states it starts at 6 or 7, and you're still trying to figure that out, we have those resources as well. So we'll link that. And Jen, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your expertise. I appreciate you. And yeah, let us know if you need anything.